Oh, there you are. Welcome to Copenhagen, Denmark. Our target this time is a rather elusive one. Despite being one of the most storied developers in all of Europe, we know very little about what goes on at IO Interactive, which is especially unfortunate considering recent events.
IO Interactive, the creators of Hitman, almost disappeared from existence when their parent company Square Enix decided to sell them off in 2017. And so not only would we have lost one of the most creative studios in Europe, but the story of how the company got to that point.
Our mission here is to find out what goes on at IO Interactive, their corporate culture, how they survived being dumped by their parent company, and ultimately, how they brought Agent 47 back from the dead.
In this multi-part series, we're going to dive headfirst into the design of Hitman and explain how the team forged each location and the simulations that bring them to life. But in today's episode, we're going to try and answer many of the lingering questions surrounding the studio's turbulent recent past, how the breakup with Square Enix went down, how the decision to make Hitman 2016 episodic caused a massive financial strain, and how much of the team that created perhaps the least well-remembered Hitman game went on to create the greatest one.
Very well then, I'll leave you to prepare.
I vividly recall the first day I went to work, and I, that experience you get walking in the door and going, hey, I'm actually working here. And I had that feeling, back in the old office, we had this staircase, spiral staircase in the middle of everything. And I caught myself even years after going up that staircase and going, hey, I work here. So it was, for we come from Denmark, it's a remarkable place to work.
Yeah.
And obviously, well known for Hitman and the Hitman series, absolutely. Well, there was a certain thing with the vibe of Silent Assassin, which was mainly around, I think, characterization and the feel of it felt larger than life to me sometimes, or the way that 47 sort of came to life as a character to me back then was pretty significant. And I think many of my sort of in-game gameplay moments, a lot of them seem to go back to Blood Money for me a lot. I recall the Mardi Gras level, but that was just purely from a visual perspective going like, what the hell is going on here? It was, to me, back then, mind-boggling to look at.
Christian is typical of many of the leads at IO Interactive today. He came on after the launch of Blood Money, a game that was released 13 years ago in 2006. Given the age of the franchise, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that there are only a handful of people at the studio who worked on Blood Money, even fewer who touched Contracts or Hitman 2, and not a single person who worked on the studio's original title, 2000's Hitman, codename 47. By the time Christian had joined the studio, it was a very different place from the scrappy upstart that had created one of the best stealth action games ever made. The company had been bought by Eidos Interactive in 2004, had grown substantially in headcount, and was developing multiple projects at once, including a next-generation Hitman game.
Yeah, so my first Hitman game was actually Hitman Absolution, which is obviously a game that is, for the fans, been a hot topic. Like, what kind of game is it? There's typically this interesting conversation saying it's a solid game, but it's not a Hitman game, and all these things. And I recall back then, sort of the mission briefing, if you will, or what we were trying to achieve, was to make Hitman very playable. Because up until that point, stuff like, basic controls of the character, getting the camera, getting combat, stealth action, all that stuff, to really just feel like you could pick up and play the game like you would pick up and play any other console game. And then I think the deeper AI, so some of the stuff that happens in Absolution where the AI actually spots you, it has full voice to actually reflect back to you what's going on, which is obviously a key component of the gameplay in a Hitman game.
It was one of these, how to not do things, where you have crazy ambition for the next Hitman, which was to top Blood Money, which, it was kind of the pinnacle, a really good game. And I think also after 4 Hitman games, I think the creatives there were maybe thinking to mix things a bit up. It was also there where IO was doing other things like mini ninjas, right? Some of the people have been there for a long time and got kids and whatnot at that point, and they wanted to do something else than killing, I guess.
And then Kane and Lynch.
Yeah, so some people want to kill more, I guess. So it's the different titles were emerging, right? And back when Absolution's original concepts were kind of formed, it was the heydays of Max Payne and Gears of War kind of thing, and that's where the trend was going, and that's what the creatives wanted back then, and that might have worked pretty well if the technology was ready. A lot of content creators were sitting and waiting for technology. Technology was not ready. A lot of frustrations, a lot of finger pointing. It was really a tough time. It took 7 years to do Absolution. It meant the industry had moved on to more open games again, whereas the formula, the main ingredient of Hitman, open levels, freedom of choice, that became kind of the thing again. The game for the longest time was done as a linear cinematic experience, and when we had to, midst of the project, change that.
IO Interactive were always known for their impressive technology. The original Hitman was among the first games to have realistic physics simulations, and the core of this technology was the studio's in-house engine, Glacier. Hakan had begun at the studio working on Glacier, but now found himself taking over as executive producer on Absolution. But initial demos of the game at E3 had not gone well. The game was originally much more linear and story-driven. It wasn't the Hitman game that fans were expecting.
We got a lot of heat for it's this doesn't feel like Hitman. It's too linear and action-packed. We did a lot, opened up a lot of locations, put in targets in there because there were no targets. We were only killing targets in cutscenes, not in the game.
One of the biggest learnings, for me personally, out of Absolution was that that if you really want a Hitman experience, it has to be about the player and his relationship to the target. And the nature of how you take out the target needs to be on your terms. It can never either be too scripted in-game, or even worse, it cannot happen in a cinematic or in some way where you're disengaged or where you don't feel like you laid all the pieces of the puzzle and now this is your final sort of act. That is the fascination of the game.
We didn't feel right at that point either, right? So it was a complete crunch. It was a bit of a monster to deal with to try to get Hitman back into Hitman. All-consuming crunch for 2 years. At that point in my professional life as well, I was relentless. Everybody needed to crunch. I remember I lived in Malmö, and that's just 30 kilometers away. So it sounds like in Sweden, not a country, but it's just a bridge. And you drive under the water in the tunnel. And there are these lights in the tunnel. They're just repeat in this same frequency when you drive. And all of a sudden, this was when the pinnacle of stress was hitting me. All of a sudden, the lights were swirling like this, right? And I had to actually stop the car and take a minute because I couldn't focus anymore, right? And I did drive a lot of people around me extremely hard. And also that was a learning experience, right? We made the game extremely proud of it. And the massive costs it took, it didn't recoup well enough in time. That was maybe also Mission Impossible.
Some of that stuff was the fundamentals were laying in Absolution. So again, when we then started thinking about Hitman 2016 and sort of the new, bringing Hitman, the sandbox game that everyone knows and loves, when we were bringing that back, one of the components was to say it needs to learn from Blood Money and it needs to take the best parts of Hitman Absolution and bring those together in something, in a new game, in a new format, if you will.
The studio didn't really know what to do for a while. Eidos had since been acquired by Square Enix, and so IO Interactive's new masters were based out of Tokyo. The studio had scaled up over the 7-year time it took to make Absolution, and while eventually the game did review favourably, it just didn't sell enough. The company went through a round of layoffs, a new project was cancelled, and the previous studio head quit. Hakan became studio production director, and the team focused on their next goal, the game that fans were craving, a worthy successor to Hitman Blood Money.
We wanted to build the best Hitman game ever built. That was, and I know you can say that as a cliche, but that's what we wanted to do. And we wanted to do it in a way where we said we have a fundamentally really good game in Absolution, with the caveat that it's lacking essential parts of what makes a great Hitman game. And then we had our legacy with Blood Money and the prior games. And we felt that if we can combine these elements into the right recipe, then we will have what will definitively be said, this is the best. That was our humble goal. It felt extremely daunting at the time because I have, how to put it, we had not built a sandbox in 10 years. And all the tooling, everything that went into that was in the previous engine, the Glacier 1 engine. So we had to invent and reinvent a lot of stuff.
Hitman has always been a community-focused game, with players on forums sharing their strategies, doing speedruns and creating custom targets. To serve this need, the team had created an online mode in Absolution called Contracts, where players could set custom targets and share them online. But much to IO's surprise, a full year after the release of Absolution, a year in which they had done basically no post-launch support, the game's Contracts mode was still pulling in around 50,000 players every day. Hardcore Hitman fans loved exploring the depth of each level, so what if they made the next Hitman a foundation that they could expand on? Instead of rebuilding the tech for every game, they'd create a platform. What they referred to publicly as the world of assassination was internally known as the Netflix of assassination. Using this platform, they'd release levels like episodes, so while players explored the depth of one level, the team could work on new ones. And perhaps by launching with just a few levels at a lower price point, they could get more players through the door, creating more positive word of mouth about this new Hitman that might correct the franchise's image problem. They'd also sell a $60 version for superfans who just wanted to buy the entire first season anyway, while making this platform always online would allow them to add new targets and game modes for free. So less of a game and more of a service, a radical idea at the time, and one that Hakan hoped players would embrace.
So the decision was, at the end, let's go full Netflix. And the strategy was this. I'm going to be absolutely honest about this. Was that, okay, we're gonna start with a starter pack, like a low entry point. Let's do a kind of Trojan horse strategy. Let's get high volumes of people paying less than $60. High volumes, we're confident we have an amazing game that will convert a big portion of these once they get a taste, because the entry point is lower than $60. Once they get a taste of it, they will convert, so it will be a higher volumes of Hitman sold than otherwise of having $60 as the entry point. So a lot of this controversy started when we talked about this business model. What is this? I'm used to consuming Hitman in this way. What is this? Is this a scam? Is this are we paying? Is this early access hidden in don't they have a publisher and stuff like that? A lot of always online. What the hell?
So did you get a lot of those $15 people though? Did you get a lot of like?
That's the thing.
Right.
So we didn't. So the strategy completely failed. It was completely opposite. So we had a high number, not high enough, lower than if it was a box product or the whole game up. A high number, like 80% of people who bought the game was people paying $60 for one episode and trusting us, even whilst they probably were bitching, trusting us that this is going to be amazing because it's IO and it's Hitman. So 80%, we estimated that 80% would be the low entry point, but the volumes will be higher, much higher, and there will only be 20% of those paying $60. But the percentage the distribution was opposite. It was 80% full price, and 20% only coming in. Now,
and was that 80% less than you would have wanted as well?
Well, the volumes were much smaller, right? The strategy did not work, much smaller, and this is where the first nervousness of Square Enix. And we had like Hitman 2 in production as well. It's a massive investment in building the whole digital platform. We had something else in the works as well, and the studio was 180 people, and we were, and a historical catastrophic start commercially.
Reviews were strong. Players were saying it might be the best Hitman game they'd ever made, but it still wasn't selling. While in the background, the studio was still working on it, adding new maps, new elusive targets, and more ways of playing the game. The hope was that with each new level, more players would be converted, and that by the end of the game's first season, once the final version was available, they'd see a flood of new players. But this constant work was starting to take its toll.
The challenge was that we had Bangkok, Colorado, and Hokkaido to finish. So I think you had a quite large team. Some people were very tired, right? I mean, the massive effort of rebooting a franchise, reimagining a franchise, and the effort that Paris was, I mean, it was, insane, the years of work that went into that, and just pulling off that level of complexity. That was the hard part, was just like, okay, the pride of having successfully rebooted this IP, but then we just had these massive maps that we had to finish.
The next episode was Sapienza. This is where things started to turn, where people are like, and there are a lot of people saying, I acknowledge it's amazing, but I'm gonna wait till the game is complete. So there was always light on the end of the tunnel, but there was always like oh shoot, they're gonna wait. And the industry was changing as well, right? These price promotions and games were coming onto lower prices much faster, and consumers were like, I'm just gonna wait. I'm gonna buy the game at half price when it's complete. Every week there was something, and this was also one of the promises. Every single week we would have something for the fans. Every week there will be something. Challenges, escalation missions, elusive target, a new bigger drop location, something every week.
When Season 1 of Hitman finished, the game had 6 large levels, dozens of elusive targets, new game modes, and even full remixes of many of the destinations. But there was still market confusion. Players weren't sure what Season 1 meant. Was the game not finished until the end of Season 2? And despite rave reviews, the initial skepticism of the release strategy hadn't really worn off. And so the boxed copy of Hitman 2016 didn't meet Square Enix's sales expectations. So, a new strategy was put in place to create a full sequel to Hitman 2016 that would fix these problems, to utilize the talented, experienced team to add new gameplay features, online modes, and even more impressive levels. Around this time, Hakan was promoted to studio head, but almost immediately, the bad news followed him.
I didn't even have my first 100 days or 90 days or whatever you say for before I had the conference call with Japan and the message that they wanted to divest, that this couldn't continue because, and this is a long story. There are things that I don't know. Decisions, discussions with shareholders. The background for completely the full picture, I wouldn't know that, but I know there was, it's announced now, the Marvel games and with Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal. I knew there was so many big investments in those projects. So I guess commercial slow start and after the disc as well, they didn't benchmark like that, and the running costs. I guess that was a big part of the decision to cut some of the costs and focus on the huge investment in the ambitious projects they had with between Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal with the Marvel projects. It was a tough message to get.
Yeah, that was kind of a crazy time. Yeah, because we had just ramped up a lot. Like we were like a lot of people, new direction, like blue ocean, let's do all these insane things and like let's work on these features that we never got to do before, but now we may have the people and the bandwidth to do it. I was working on Patient Zero at the time, which is like the game of the year, and we had finished doing the free starter pack, as far as I remember, where we did like a rework of the yacht. And I was also pregnant at the time, so it was like extra exciting. I was actually sitting working, and everyone was like, they stopped working around me, and I thought they were very noisy. And I actually ordered noise-canceling headphones from IT. I was like, why are people so noisy today? And then someone came down and was like, are you guys okay? I was like, yeah. I think it's a little noisy, but I'm fine, like what's happening? And then she's like, oh, you don't know? And Lasse was sitting next to him like, how can you not know? It's everywhere on the news, like it's all over. I was like, oh, okay. And then from that moment, people just started playing board games and just stopped working. And we were like a few people who just like, I'm just gonna keep working because I'm not sure what else to do. Like this is so weird.
I was in the US and I'd just been on a road trip in Utah in like Valley of the Gods and without internet, and I was like for 4 days, and I was like, that feeling where you're like, oh, what if something crazy is gonna happen because I'm not on the internet? Then we got back to LA to my friend's place, and then like my phone logged onto their Wi-Fi, and then like this message popped in from my ex-boyfriend actually, and he was like, this Kotaku article saying Square Enix dumps IO Interactive, and he was like, is this gonna affect you? And I was like, and it was like midnight, we'd been driving all day, and I was like, shit! Oh my God! And I knew it was like morning in Denmark, so I wrote Mette from, who's a level designer here. I was like, Mette, are you at work? What the hell is going on?
Like HR were really good at very quickly like catching it and going, okay, now we're gonna talk about what's going to happen and what the procedure is, and talking with unions and all that stuff. Like now we're gonna, like, what are the rules? Because we have very specific rules in Denmark. When you fire more than, I think it's 40%, it's a mass firing, and then specific things have to happen in a very specific order.
At what stage did you realize that you weren't one of the people who was going to get let go?
That was when I didn't get an email. Like we would get an email. If you got fired, you would get an email at a specific point. So we're just sitting and updating.
In the office or at home?
In the office.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and then people just started like getting up and leaving. Like that was like, ugh, that was excruciating, yeah.
What was it like the next, so it was all one day that happened?
It was that one, yeah.
What was the next day like when there was all this space?
Weird and uncomfortable. We managed to find the bright side of it, and plus all our co-workers had a pretty sweet deal. Like they just had like 4 months off full pay. Square was super cool also in the breakup. I was very surprised at how they handled it. Very, very cool in the process. So Yeah, and so they were just like Facebook, like sitting, drinking beer, hanging out, and they all got job offers and jobs really fast. So that's the weird part of like this ecosystem, that when a big company dies, like tons of small companies are born that make amazing things. So a part of me couldn't help being a little bit excited on their behalf as well. Like they're gonna go out there and do really cool stuff too. So it wasn't like all bad. It was more the fact that you realize I'm not gonna see this person again every day. That was the hard part, I think.
IO Interactive was close to 200 employees before 40% of the workforce was let go, a time they rather amusingly refer to as Squexit. From talking to people at the studio, it sounds like most, if not all, of those affected managed to find jobs in the area, either at Unity down the road, Massive across the bridge in Malmo, or somewhere else close by. The other thing that stood out to me from our time at the studio was how much respect the remaining staff seemed to have for Square Enix. A few months prior to the breakup, we had actually interviewed Square Enix CEO Mitsuda-san for our documentary on Final Fantasy XIV. And even then he talked about how much of a fan of the Hitman franchise he was. But away from the media, both Square Enix and IO's management were trying to find a new home for the studio and the Hitman IP. But instead of just selling off to the highest bidder, rather decently, Square Enix ensured that any deal was to be a three-way negotiation between all concerned parties.
There are some other companies that both Square Enix and we were not interested in. In all this in this process, Square Enix have been absolutely genuine, real, empathetic, reasonable. Because I was pouring my heart out in terms of like, give us this chance to define our own destiny. We know our franchise best. We believe in this. So the scenario of an MBO, management buyout, became scenario A. We were discussing this. We ended up doing an MBO and bought the company and took over and have the full control, own the company and have the, we got Freedom Fighters and Hitman with us. Mean Ninjas and King Lynch was done while it was with Square Enix. So that's with them, that's my IP thing. But it wasn't easy because I knew taking over, the cash flow was low. Super hard decisions needed to be made, which I had to do, and I went through with that. I mean, almost half of the studio we had to let go. We went through a huge restructuring, closing down some of these other activities, and just focusing on Hitman, focusing on the future of Hitman 2 as well.
Yeah, that was just like, well, what are we gonna do now? Like, cause we just lost, well, not only like colleagues, we lost friends, and we're like, these people were super important in our process, and we knew the work they had done, amazing work on the previous Hitman, so we were just like, how are we ever going to make something as good as 2016 ever again? Like that's not even possible.
Square Enix still retains a financial stake in IO Interactive, but that's where their involvement begins and ends. The deal made it possible for the managers to buy back their own company and regain control over its future. But that future still seemed short. Even with mass layoffs, the company had a huge cash flow problem. Not only that, but the Hitman they envisaged was larger in scale than the original reboot, and almost impossible to create with what now remained of their staff. Around this time, only a quarter of the game was complete.
So we did do a lot of descoping on the feature side. The original dream of systemics that would contribute to replay, we reevaluated that. And on the location and mission side, a lot of foundational work had already been done.
I think you can tell that by the time we started building Hitman 2, it was not a question about how do we build the sandbox. We felt that, after Hitman 2016, we had succeeded. People play it and, wow, we did it. It felt like we really got to mix the parts of, there's some vintage blood money stuff with some really playable Absolution game mechanics and something new to create 2016. But then we could then start jamming and figuring out new things like, hey, what if you can't even find your target in the beginning? which to us, I don't think we would have dared pull that off in the previous outing. But experimenting with game mechanics like that, there's a lot of things where we just said, why not go for something new?
We did change the scope for the other maps. When we had Squexit, we were planning on 5 locations, actually, five large locations, and that changed after Squexit, where we looked at 6 and then thought, well, we could go for small to medium maps, if you will, small with New Zealand. Even though real estate-wise, it's the largest map we've ever made. With Vermont, we decided to do an homage to A New Life, of course, which most people picked up on. With Vermont, it was really like, okay, we don't have much time. We have a few people who are very clever and who we trust very much. We want to focus on modularity and systemics. Go. Blood money, go.
The time was ticking on the studio and the staff could feel it. Hakan told us that he learned his lesson about crunch during the Absolution days, and in the 7 years since, the studio had never entered a phase of crunch. But he also admits that the general level of fear and uncertainty during this time made it so people were pushing a lot harder than they should have been. At least this time they had an ace up their sleeve: the platform. All this work that had gone into creating the world of Assassination meant that the team could roll out new levels much faster than a traditional sequel, while the general stability of the engine made it so that they were able to add new features to the game while retrofitting many of them into the older levels. Even with the more focused scope of this sequel, the company was running out of cash fast, and while Hitman 2016 had reviewed well, turned around public opinion on the franchise, and had been incredibly well received by fans, the reason they were in this situation in the first place was because it simply didn't sell. Hakan's strategy of creating a low entry price point to get people through the door hadn't worked, but there was one more card they could play: the ultimate low entry point: nothing.
So we made the start of the game free, the tutorial, and we had 1.8 million players 1st of April. So shortly after, end of June, we went from 1.8 to 5.6 million users. And a lot of them were converting and buying the game. So we expected this, but it went like this.
This cash flow allowed them to focus on creating a Game of the Year edition of Hitman 2016, but it didn't feel like enough to just pack in all the content they created for Season 1, so the team created an entirely new bonus campaign, Patient Zero, which remixed the original levels and added new targets.
Then we did the Christmas mission, taking Paris, redressing it as in Christmas time, having a Home Alone kind of mission in there, where we're going to take on the Santa Claus and teleport around, and gave like free for a week, and then you can upgrade to the full experience and whatnot. And it just grew.
Something had changed. The game was now selling. It had a vocal community telling their friends to pick it up. And while the team had worked hard to add content to the game all the way through Season 1, they felt that they had a lot more wind in their sails now, and crucially, more cash coming through the door to help fund the development of Hitman 2. So what exactly was different? Had the team finally gotten enough players to talk about the game? Had they changed public opinion on the franchise? Had games like Destiny and Warframe finally brought mainstream acceptance of the games as a service model? Or was it something else? Had the near death of IO Interactive suddenly activated a community of players who wanted to support the studio, to show their love for the franchise, and to give this new Hitman a shot? This influx of new players not only helped keep the studio afloat, but it showed prospective business partners that there was an audience for these games. Soon after, they secured additional funding by signing a deal with Warner to help publish Hitman 2. Creating a sequel on such a small timeline would have been impossible for many studios, but not only were they well versed in the game that they had created, but crucially, for the first time ever, the technology was already there. This world of assassination platform may not have worked as a selling point for players, but this platform, this single executable, helped them build new maps and plug in new missions much quicker than before. Hitman 2 was developed by a team cut in half in around 1 year and 9 months.
We released Hitman 2. Back when we went independent and on cash flow, it was so far away. But getting there was was an amazing feeling. And Hitman is a trilogy. There's a bright future. There's this fully realization of the whole world assassination that we are looking towards as well, of doing the journey since 2013 to complete that, and the overarching spy story to complete that. And the world assassination, when that's complete, it's gonna be one game with all the locations starting from Paris in Hitman 1 to the last location in the Hitman 3, with 20 plus location. So the ultimate globe-trotting experience that we wanted to achieve.
That's the beautiful thing of mastery is as long as creatively you can keep sparking new ideas, then I don't think the teams will ever run out of new and crazy ways of playing with the idea of a target and a sandbox, if you know what I mean. And I don't think the formula will, grow old, if you will. I also think that's why, we can look back on 20 years of Hitman and say, well, on some level, the essence, the nucleus of Hitman is still the same, if you will. A little bit like, I don't know, pick your sport, soccer, football, whatever. It's the same, but you kind of enjoy it every time because it's fundamentally a fun experience. Yeah, and I don't see us running out of ideas, for what could go on in the sandbox anytime soon.
It's strange to hear about the hard times when you visit I/O today. We've spent 3 years visiting studios around the world, and the work-life balance we saw here in Copenhagen is remarkable by any standards. People wandered into work around 10 after dropping their kids off at school. Much of the studio left to go home between 4 and 5. They tend to hire exceptional young people and give them a shot. They like having short meetings and just making sure the work is done. Hakan says that the marathon of creating a constantly updated game like Hitman means that people have to take it easy, but that doesn't mean that the studio is resting on its laurels. Earlier this year, IO Interactive opened up a new studio across the bridge in Malmö, Sweden, and while much of the team is working on new Hitman content and looking ahead to a third Hitman game, one that Hakan says may once again go episodic, the majority of the studio, at least here in Copenhagen, is working on something secret, and rather excitingly, something new.
We are still very much independent. We're looking into the future with new things. Potentially new IPs that we might be working on, and we've created 4 original IPs from scratch. We've always worked on, created these characters and worlds and whatnot. This is a part of our DNA. I'm looking forward to bring new stuff as well, apart from growing Hitman into the world.